Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the person who is responsible for this symposium, our graduate and Emmy Award-winning Hall of Fame announcer for the Los Angeles Dodgers, and our namesake of the Charlie Steiner School of Sports Communication, Charlie Steiner.
Good morning. Now, I must confess to you, when I'm introduced like that, I feel like I have died. And he's talking about what I had done. When I got here in 1967, 50 years ago, there were two broadcasting classes. One was Broadcasting 101, and the other was Broadcasting 201. Our radio station was at the Student Center, and it was about as big as a phone booth. I knew what I wanted to be when I grew up. I just wasn't quite sure how to get there. In the ensuing, 50 years, the business has morphed from, in this town, there were 4 AM radio stations, 3 FM radio stations, and 3 television stations. That was it. Nobody then had any idea how this industry would evolve into what it has become. It would have been unimaginable to think of a sports communication school. Certainly more unimaginable with my name affixed to it. So I am enormously proud to be part of this here at my alma mater. I still can't believe my name is affixed to it. It is. And I take what I do and what we do really seriously. One of the things that I have, from the time we first started talking about being a part of all this, it is vitally important that we tell the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. The issue is, how do we convey that so that you, at some point, can actually make a living doing it? One of the things that we can do is help craft a lead to a story, whether it's in print, videotape, on radio, the ability to communicate. That's what we can do. We can guide you to tell that story. How we get it from point A to point B is a process now that we still don't quite understand. The thought of cable television 50 years ago was unimaginable. The thought of internet, unimaginable. What it's going to look like 5 or 10 years from now, unimaginable. And so I had a much more conventional route to the place that I arrived at by beginning in Peoria and then working at a radio station in Davenport, New Haven, Hartford, Cleveland, New York, eventually to ESPN, the Yankees, and now the Dodgers. That was, in my time, a conventional route, working your way up the ladder. But now with the advent of the internet and blogs and all of the stuff that I fundamentally do not understand, I don't. But I have a reasonable skill of sharing a story. So that was old school, going from one market to the next. This new school, in which you have now entered, how we get you to a point where you can actually make a living doing it, I don't know. I don't. And that's one of the reasons for this opening panel. This is the 3rd year of our symposium. SportsCom is, about 9 years old now. And one of the things that I strive for, and I want the faculty to strive for, is to make this glorious profession relevant and, yes, sufficiently profitable that you can feed your faces and your family's faces. So that's the challenge that we face, and over the course of the day, in the various different panels, we'll get to that. But the most important panel is this one, not only because it's first, but it's relevant. How are you going to make a living doing what you desire to do? And when you do it, one of the things I can tell you, you'll find nothing more satisfying than what it is that we do. And I've said this over the years here. In our business, we are paid to tell the truth. Not every business can say that. But if we tell a story as fairly, as accurately, as entertainingly as possible, your job is done. Our job now is to get you out into the workforce and make some dough doing it. And with that, I will shut up and let the experts talk. And Paul Gullifor, who's been involved in all of this from the very beginning, will moderate, and we'll see you over the course of the day. Have a wonderful time. Thank you.
And thank you, Charlie. And before we begin, I'd also like to thank Paul Herzog of Mass Mutual for their support and sponsorship of this symposium. And Paul is over here. Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you for being part of this. Well, welcome everybody to the first panel in the third annual Charlie Steiner Symposium on Sports Communication and what you can do with a graduate degree. I'd like to start by introducing all of the panelists with a very brief introduction. You have the complete bio in your program, but I think it helps to know a little bit about their backgrounds. I am the Associate Chair of the Department of Communication. I'm pleased to moderate this panel. The panelists are all very accomplished, and you're very fortunate to have access to all three of these this morning. To my immediate right, your left, is Bradley University President Gary Roberts. He's considered one of the foremost sports law experts and scholars in the country. He is Dean Emeritus and was the Gerald L. Bepko Professor of Law of the McKinney School of Law at Indiana University in Indianapolis, where he served as Dean from 2007 to 2013. Prior to that, he spent 24 years at Tulane University Law School, serving as Vice Dean, Deputy Dean, and the Sumter Davis Marks Professor of Business Law. He was also the founder and director of the first sports law program in the United States while at Tulane. President Roberts has continued to practice law part-time throughout his academic career with a focus on antitrust and sports law. He has been a frequent commentator on broadcast and in print media on sports-related legal and business issues. He was the on-air legal analyst for the NFL Network and a lead analyst for other national media outlets during the National Football League lockout in 2011. He has testified before congressional committees on 9 occasions on sports matters. He earned a bachelor's degree from Bradley University and a JD from Stanford University. Please join me in welcoming Gary Roberts to the Steiner Symposium.
That was brief.
Cut it down. Kathryn Statz. Ms. Statz has worked in collegiate athletics for nearly 30 years. She began her executive search career in July, joining Snodgrass Partners and focusing upon Director of Athletics and Olympic Sports head coach searches. For 15 years, Ms. Statz served as Senior Associate Director of Athletics at DePaul University. In that role, she was responsible for the administration of DePaul's varsity sports, oversaw NCAA compliance matters, and was responsible for all contractual matters within the athletics department. She also served as a deputy Title IX coordinator for DePaul. Ms. Statz came to DePaul after spending 8 years at Marquette University, where she served as an assistant athletics director for Olympic sports, marketing, and compliance. Among her many duties with the Golden Eagles, she served as the department's senior woman administrator and chair of the university's Gender Equity Committee. Ms. Statz also has extensive experience with the NCAA and conference affiliations. She was a member of the NCAA Management Council from 2000 to 2004 and had previously served as an eligibility appeals representative with the organization from 1992 to 1994. She earned her bachelor's degree in communication from Mundelein College, where she was a student athlete, and she completed her law degree at Marquette University. Please join me in welcoming Ms. Kathryn Statz. And Dr. Andrew Billings is the Executive Director of lights.
We didn't pay the bill this month. There it is.
And this is why we need Paul's sponsorship, is to pay for the electricity here. Dr. Andrew Billings is the Executive Director of the Alabama Program in Sports Communication and Ronald Reagan Chair of Broadcasting in the Department of Journalism and Creative Media. He is this country's foremost scholar in sports communication. His research interests lie in the intersection of sport, mass media, consumption habits, and identity-laden content, which I hope you'll explain to us at some point during this panel. With 14 books and over 140 journal articles and book chapters, he is one of the most published sports media scholars in the world. His work has won numerous awards, and he has lectured in nations around the globe. He has been interviewed over 500 times, today will be 501, by media outlets ranging from the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times to ESPN. He earned a bachelor's, a master's, and PhD at the University of Indiana. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Andy Billings. Thank you all for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll start this with a question for each of the panelists it's kind of an extended biography, give us a chance to get to know them just a little bit better. But I will tell you, it works best if we have questions from the audience, so don't hesitate. If something comes up, raise your hand, and I will make sure your question gets asked. It's more important that your questions get asked than mine, because you see, I've been to graduate school. So please, don't hesitate. If you have questions, raise your hand, and I will make sure you will get your question in. So, as a starter, could each of you in turn please speak to your decision to pursue postgraduate education? What prompted that decision? What career aspirations led you to seek an advanced degree? And Gary, if we can start with you, and we'll just work down the panel.
It was so long ago, I can't remember. But when I graduated from Bradley, I thought I was going into the military because my draft number came up 2. But then I flunked my physical. So I taught high school here in Limestone, in Bartonville, for 2 years. But I knew I didn't want to just settle for a bachelor's degree, so I started looking at graduate options and ultimately decided that a law degree would give me the greatest flexibility and open more doors than any other. And so I started applying to law schools, and I think that was the right judgment, frankly. I thought about a PhD in economics, I thought about a PhD in history, but I ultimately thought those were just too confining in what I could do with them. So I went to law school, and just luckily, I had no plans to get involved with the sports industry, but when I graduated and clerked for a federal judge for a year, I went to Washington, D.C. with what was then the largest law firm in Washington, Covington and Burling, and we just happened to represent the National Football League as well as the National Hockey League, and I ended up doing most of the work I did there for 7 years for those 2 clients, and it just kind of took off from there as to how I got involved in sports. It wasn't planned at all, it was just serendipitous, but that's how I got going in that direction.
Okay, Kathryn?
My story has some parallels. After my undergrad was done, I had been involved with writing for our paper at the university I attended, and was fortunate enough to receive an internship with the NCAA, which I think today I wouldn't have even gotten a sniff to do that. But back in the pioneer days when this happened, I was fortunate enough to be selected to do an internship, and I later was employed full-time by the NCAA National Office. I became an investigator there, and I was the only one on the staff that I worked with that didn't have any advanced degree. And so again, times are different now, but my colleagues fortunately, had the wherewithal to be direct with me and say, you've got to get an advanced degree to advance in this field. So you decide what it's going to be. And I knew that I didn't necessarily have the wherewithal to do it on my own, and so I was fortunate to receive a job offer with Marquette, and I was allowed to go to law school part-time. So 5 glorious years later, I finished law school, and so I also didn't get a graduate degree. But I knew that I was going to stay in sports. So I went to law school with the intention of continuing to stay in the field.
Thank you. Andy?
You know, honestly, if I'm trying to think of when did I start to feel like I'd seek out graduate education, it goes back to 26 years ago on this day in Peoria, Illinois. I know that sounds weird, but I was on the speech team at Indiana University. The biggest speech tournament there was always at Bradley University. I think it still is, at least in that fall semester.
Last weekend.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. It's weird to be here in November and not be at the tournament. And for whatever reason, that day, there was kind of a light bulb moment. I was able to win after dinner speaking, and it made me feel like maybe there was a place for what my skill set was to fit in the world of communication. Now, it took me several years to figure out where in that world. So, I was, a master's degree was in speech communication. I thought I wanted to do rhetoric. It turned out I wanted to work with numbers. I didn't even think about sports. What I knew was I wanted to look at the science of the popular. What makes something move the needle? And even back then in the 90s, it was about, we're starting to have all this fragmentation, all these niche areas. And very quickly, I started to look at sports as that one thing that really brought people together. And I was seeing new research on, there was this new MTV show called The Real World. It was getting a lot of research written about it. I'm like, okay, yes, but the sports rating is 10 times higher. Why aren't we talking about sports? And so it led me to that because it seemed to be this common language for people. And at the time, it seemed to be that everyone wanted to dismiss it. And one of my favorite things to do is to push back on any of that common notion. So for me, it was coming through from that speech team experience and figuring out where communication fits in the world. And then wasn't even until really the doctoral program before I realized sports was really where I wanted that to resonate.
Thank you. Andy, if I could follow up on that, you mentioned the tendency to dismiss sports as a line of scientific inquiry. Have we won that battle, or is that battle still being waged?
With some, yes, and with some, no, and that's the way it's always going to be, because people are going to say, well, this is distraction, this is just fluff, this is just games. And I think no matter where you look at it, the response is sports wield power. And you can say that fan behavior is stupid, you can say it's over-involved or whatever it is, but you cannot dismiss the dollars, you can't dismiss the amount of time that people spend on it, you can't dismiss the role it plays in higher education. You can't dismiss some of those things. And so to me, it was always persuasion, I think, is most likely to happen when you don't think it's coming. So, if you're going to have a discussion about race at the dinner table, oh my gosh, this is a serious thing, we're going to talk about race. But if it's a sports media broadcast, we're talking about race. And that cuts both ways. I know even last night I was hearing Jordy Nelson for the Packers, a white wide receiver, was called sneaky multiple times. I'm like, are they saying he's deceptively fast? Is that implying something about the white-black dichotomy? To me, all that persuasion is happening. And I do think, and truly efforts like the Steiner School have legitimized that, and we've made it clear this isn't just about fans being fans. This is about something larger, and we can ask huge issues about our society.
Thank you. We have students who are considering graduate school. In fact, for a program like ours, I'm sometimes amazed at how many of our students do pursue graduate education, especially considering we don't have a graduate program in communication at Bradley. But we are at a time of year where a lot of students are asking this question. We've had pre-registration recently, and they're thinking about their futures. And so if you would, each of you finish the following sentence for our students. You should strongly consider graduate school or graduate degree if. Gary?
Well, first of all, I would ask what graduate school means. Does that include professional schools? It would include law school.
Right.
If that's a tough sentence to finish. I think that graduate education, professional education, forces you to think about things at a level you've never been able to think about before. And it gives you a credential, it gives you credibility out in the real world that most people don't have. I chose law school, and I think it was the right choice because it opens a lot of doors. It's an extremely flexible degree. With a law degree, you not only can practice law, but you can go into business. You stop and think, most of the commissioners of the major sports leagues over the last several decades have been lawyers. The heads of the players' union have been lawyers. The head of most sports federations are lawyers. The head of the United States Olympic Committee right now is a lawyer. Law school teaches you problem solving. It teaches you how to think analytically. It teaches you a whole range of skills that are incredibly valuable. Even if you're going into broadcasting, there are a number of broadcasters that have law degrees now. Because it informs you about the world at a level that you don't get just with an undergraduate degree. And so the only downside, I think, to a law degree or any graduate degree is the fact that it takes 3 years out of your life and a lot of money to go. So you have to decide whether or not you think the long-term return on investment is worth it. And I don't mean just the dollar return, not how much money are you going to make over your lifetime, but how fun and interesting is your career going to be, and how fun and interesting is your life going to be. And I think the payback on that is phenomenal. If you can come up with the money to pay for the tuition, and you can afford the opportunity costs of taking 2-3 years out of your life to go get an advanced degree, I think it is more than worth it.
Thank you. Kathryn, you
So
should strongly consider postgraduate education if.
If you're ready to immerse yourself, and if that's where you're at in your thought process. And I'm going to answer that from the perspective of someone who's teaching a graduate class at Northwestern right now. And I would say my experience right now is indicative of the divide between people who are in graduate school because they think that's that right next path, and people who are in graduate school because they're passionate about what they're studying. And the irony is I just got ethics thesis papers handed to me on Thursday before I came down here, and it's very clear to me who is in grad school because someone told them that's that right next step, and who's in grad school because they want to get a master's in sports administration and they love it and they're willing to immerse themselves in it. So, and it doesn't mean that everyone's at that stage in their life, right? It's a decision that you have to make. And sometimes people aren't ready to say, I want to immerse myself in anything when they're a week out of undergrad. It's a sort of a frame of mind to have to say, wow, what an amazing opportunity at this time in my life, whether it's a year out, it's 2 months out, or in my case, it was 15 years out. So I think the if answer is if your mind is telling you that you're ready to really embrace whatever that grad degree is that you decide to study. Unless you're passionate about writing a paper and doing the research, it's not going to resonate in a way that is important enough to make it that next step for you. You gotta have in your head that this is the time in my life to do this. And oh, by the way, it's a huge opportunity that I'm going to give myself.
Yeah, I would agree with a lot of what they say. I'd also say you should consider it if you want to have the maximum number of doors open for you. And that is precluding, like, if there's a great opportunity right before you. I understand that entirely. I think the sports world is littered with people who they had to take their opportunity because it came to them right away. And Bob Costas left Syracuse early because he got a job calling ABA games in St. Louis and said, hey, I can come back and finish if this doesn't work, but I've got to jump now. Yeah. Joe Buck left Indiana early because he had a chance to do national broadcasts for Fox at that age. So there are exceptions, but if you don't have one of those cases, then you want to have the maximum number of doors open to you. And I'll even say lots of times you aren't even thinking that far down the road necessarily, but having that credential is so critical. So for instance, we were hiring a sports instructor industry level position last year, and it was right about the same time as some of the ESPN layoffs. There were people who were laid off at ESPN who were very interested in the job there. Our job required a master's degree. Didn't matter that they had great experience on SportsCenter or whatever it was. They still didn't have the credential for us to even look. So I think that's important. I also think it's useful for breaking through the clutter, to be able to specialize, to be able to work with different parts of the industry. So maybe that's in sports broadcasting where you're like, this is where I get my demo reel. And it is for a lot of those people. It's where you get that chance. But it helps winnow that down. I'll give you the example of, for instance, at Alabama, we have the second largest college of communication, accredited college of communication in the country. We have over 1,000 students that are just public relations majors. All right? How do you work through that clutter? Well, one way is that master's program where they work with clients. We have a group of students who will be at the Country Music Awards tomorrow night because that's their client that they were working on, for the semester. That's the kind of thing you can't do for 1,000 students, but for our 40 master's students in that field, that can really help. Final thing I'll say is I also think you should pursue a graduate education if you truly have something to say. And that doesn't necessarily mean on paper or whatever it is, but one of my mantras is that there is no substitute in this world for having something to say. You might not even know what that is yet, but you're trying to tease out that idea. And I think that's a great place for you to do it in graduate work.
Okay, thank you. Let me pause there and see if there's any questions from the audience. Yes?
Was there any point in your graduate career where you thought this might not be for me, or you thought you made the wrong mistake?
Is there any point in your graduate career you thought this might be a mistake? And is this targeted to any panelists in particular, or all three of them? Okay.
No.
I'll answer that differently. So I was about 3 years into law school, and as I said, it took me 5 years because I went part-time. And I was in a negotiation workshop, so somewhat similar to a grad class, a typical grad class. And my instructor asked me would I come meet with her. And at that time, I was working full-time in the athletic department. I was hanging on by the skin of my teeth. I was exhausted. I was trying my best, but taking 3 law classes at a time when you're working full-time is hard. Mm-hmm. For me, it was hard. For others, it may not have been, but for me, it was really challenging. And I thought to myself, she's gonna sit me down and say, I've seen you falling asleep in class, and I've seen you struggling to put papers together, and I think you should really rethink what you're doing. And I knew in my mind that that's what that conversation was going to be, because I just knew, and so I thought about it, and I said to myself, I'm ready to step away from finishing this degree, because the jig is up, right? That people know that I'm barely here, and I'm really, really struggling. And it turned out she asked me to be her teaching assistant, and I have no idea why. I don't know if she saw that I was trying, and I cared about what I was doing enough that I questioned myself. But that was my sort of aha moment where it was the rubber hit the road that day. And I said, if she's going to say to me that you're a fraud, I'm going to say you're right. And she gave me the encouragement that I needed to actually go the other way. So.
I don't know that I ever really second-guessed it. I can tell you why I didn't, and that was because I knew I wanted to be in education, in higher education, and I was fortunate that I always had an assistantship where I was in the classroom or working with those students. So if you were ever seeming too divorced from that prize of getting to teach or work with those students, whatever it was, in those classes where you feel like, I don't even know half of what's going on, I always could come back to the interactions with the students and say, this is enjoyable, this is what I want to do. There was something weird about the fact that, yes, things will change over time somewhat, but these students are always going to be at that stage of their life that they're ready to explore new ideas and new careers and things. That's always going to be the case, and I've always had a lot of enthusiasm for that.
Other questions? Yes, Kelly?
Mr. Billings, you kind of hit on this, but with broadcasting kind of being limited and you want to kind of jump in, and also if you want to get in the business realm, do you think that a student should go straight to graduate school or get some work experience in the field first and then go to graduate school? And that's open to everybody.
To repeat, should students go directly into graduate school out of their bachelor's program, or should they take some time to get the professional experience with the intent of returning to graduate school at some point?
Did you have something there? No.
Go.
I'll say it all depends on what your options are. So for instance, if you really have an opportunity to get any entry-level position at a major sports network, if it's in broadcast or whatever it is, get in there. I was, for instance, one time I was with the Fox NFL crew, which was like 80 people when you count producers and everything there, and almost everyone in the room, except for former athletes, were like in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and then you see this crew over here of people who are in their 20s. I'm like, how did they get in this room that quickly? They were tech people, they were social media, they were doing something that these other people weren't trained in, but they're like, that person swept my floors for 6 months. That person showed the work ethic, whatever it is. But what I mean with the options is, if you're like, hey, I can do this, or I can do, my friend and I are thinking we can get some sponsors for a local podcast, I'll say, you might have better options just at the master's program. I've talked to our students who'll be like, well, why would you do that when, like one of our clients was Dale Earnhardt Jr., and we were going to do a podcast called Junior College, and it'd be a college version of his, radio podcast. That's got a much better chance to break through than something local there. So I wouldn't turn down ESPN or Fox or NBC or any of those places if you have any sort of in. Go get that experience and potentially come back. But barring those opportunities, grad school can be pretty solid.
Well, I would add to that. I think spending some time in the real world before you go back for a professional or a graduate degree has great value because it gives you a perspective on life and paying taxes and having to put up with the pressures of everyday life that really, I think, enriches your graduate studies. The downside is it delays by a couple of years your ultimate career path, which gets back to do you have the money and the time to delay pursuing your career full tilt. But it also depends on what your opportunities are too. I mean, it's better to be in graduate school right under undergraduate school than being unemployed and living under the I-10 overpass. And if you're just bagging groceries at a grocery store, you're probably not enhancing your skill set much. But if you've got an opportunity to do something in the field that you really want to go into, or in business in some way, there's great value in doing that. It's just it delays your career by a couple of years.
And the only thing I would add to that is you might need some time to figure out what it is you want to study in grad school. There's a myriad of ways you can go, right? It doesn't have to be sports communication. You may find out that those last 2 classes that you take here at Bradley that you want to do sports admin, or all of a sudden you think you might want to become an academic advisor. You know, you might have that one aha moment that that needs discernment, and you might want to think about, well, where am I going to go? And gosh, might there be a graduate assistantship available for me that I don't have to think about taking out these loans that are going to be so significant? There's so many graduate opportunities for either teaching assistantships or grad assistantships that I know you've probably talked about in your classes, but you know, that takes a lot of research too to find out where the best fit is and to apply for those positions, because they're highly sought after. I feel like when I was leaving DePaul this last May, we had 2 grad assistantships turn over in our media relations department, and I bet we had 100 applicants for those 2 positions, you know, and I don't have to tell you guys how competitive that is. So someone who, I know that one of the people selected was someone who had volunteered with a professional softball team in his area of the country. And so that was his leg up, that he had completed undergrad. He had done work in the athletic department as an undergrad, but then he did additional work specific to that industry, and that's what got him hired over the other 98 people. So unfortunately, we can't answer your question other than to say it's specific to you. But to me, it should be something that you think thoroughly about as opposed to you fall into it, right?
Thank you. Other questions? Gary, you've mentioned something a couple of times now, and that is the investment required of students in terms of time and finances to pursue an advanced education. And this is something that resonates with our students, I'm sure. They've been in school for 4 years and the thought of continuing on for another couple of years, and many of them have accumulated debt to get their bachelor's degree, and the thought of investing even further is fairly daunting. So is there anything that any of you as panelists can say that might diminish their concerns or encourage them in some way to not let that be a factor necessarily?
No.
Okay.
Everything in life is a cost-benefit analysis, and you have to weigh that. I think that the cost of going to law school or graduate school is short-term, and the benefits are a lifetime. And so it's kind of hard to measure the short-term versus the long-term. So I think that you have to be careful not to allow the short-term costs to overwhelm your judgment. I think graduate education is worth making a lot of short-term sacrifices for. But to say that it's irrelevant or not important is just not realistic. You know, when you graduate with all those debts, you got to pay the loans off. And you know, if you can't afford to do that, that's something that you have to take into consideration. The greatest cost from my standpoint of going to graduate school, and particularly law school, because it's a 3-year program, is the opportunity costs that you're giving up. You're giving up 3 years of income and 3 years of real-world experience to get that degree. Again, I think that you'll have that degree for 50, 60 years, and it will provide enormous benefits over that lifetime. But if you can't afford it in the short term, that's just a reality you have to take into account.
Okay.
And I guess I would add to that, you know, my guess is we have some student athletes in the room who are also pursuing this field. I mean, one way that I like to couch this to former student athletes is to say, you walked away from undergrad with not very much debt or no debt. And so here you are. Grad school should be an easy decision for you if that's something that you're weighing on the financial spectrum, right? You are legs up over other people because you made this commitment to be a student athlete while you were an undergrad. So don't take lightly the fact that you have minimal or little debt compared to others, okay? And you can remind your mom and dad that, hey, I did this to get through undergrad. Can you give me a little help with grad school maybe? I don't know. So that would be one point. And I think, too, the other way to look at it is times have changed so much, and there are so many options to do graduate school remotely. There's so many distance options that you could do and also work at the same time. So there are a lot of ways to go to grad school or law school. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing full-time or don't go at all.
That's a good point.
So that's sort of my story.
The only other thing I would add is the availability of assistantships is actually quite high in communication-related fields. Because especially, obviously, public speaking, but also interpersonal and things like that, but also intro to mass comm and things like that. Because so many students need to take those classes, many times you will be taught or have a TA that is a person who is on graduate assistantship, and people might not realize how those things work. In general, it depends on where you're going or what you're doing. For a master's level assistantship, you might get $12,000 to $15,000 a year, but you also get a tuition waiver, which covers, everything but those activity fees, things like that. In exchange for that, you work roughly 20 hours a week in the department. Maybe you're teaching a pair of classes. One class, they tend to equate out to 10 hours a week. If it's a mass lecture, it might be, one class covers 20 hours. But you're still going to be broke. But that's being broke is different than being in debt. That's a whole different thing. I was broke. I always, I could double the value of my car by filling up the tank with gas. All right, that's how broke I was. I would buy the books for the semester and read them all early so I could return them for a full credit, and then just hopefully have taken good notes when we cover it months later, because that's how broke I was. I was down to $8 when I started my first job, but I didn't have the debt. And so you're not going to get through grad school wealthy unless you were already. But there are ways that you can mitigate that with those assistantships.
Other audience questions? Well, one question I get pretty regularly from students is those that have decided to pursue advanced education. They decide they want to get a master's degree or a law degree, and they typically ask, I don't know where to apply. What school should I apply to? So what are the criteria that should guide that decision?
I can't speak for graduate schools because my whole experience has been law schools. You should try and find a law school that is appropriate for your academic level. If you can get into one of the most elite law schools and do well there, those are the schools you should try and get into. But you also should try and find a school that's going to appeal to your personal style. So some law schools are huge. It's just like an undergraduate program. There's a big difference between a UCLA and a Bradley and a Eureka College. And some people thrive at the big institutions and others don't. And the same is true for law schools. And you might also try and find a program that has professors that you're going to relate to well, and if you want to go to visit the school and meet with some of the professors and just get a feel for how you're going to relate to them, that's helpful as well. But basically, at the bottom line, you should go to the best law school you can get into that will suit your style and your interests. Don't go to a school because it doesn't have electricity. Anyway, I can keep talking in the dark. I've been doing it all my life. So, but I would not go to a law school if you're interested in sports law, for example. I would not go to a law school simply because they have a sports law program. To be successful in any industry, including the sports industry, you want to be the best lawyer you can be. And I know, because I've talked to a lot of executives in the sports world, when they're looking to fill a job, whether it's a legal job or an administrative job or any kind of job, they look for the most talented person. If they're looking for a lawyer, they look for the most talented lawyer. They're not looking for a sports lawyer, they're looking for a good lawyer. And so go to the best law school you can and look for opportunities at that school to pursue your interest in sports. But I started this sports law program at Tulane, and Tulane's an excellent law school. If you can get into Tulane and you're interested in sports law, it's a great option. But, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I remember one year we had a kid came to our sports law program who had gotten into Harvard and Stanford and turned them down to come to the Tulane sports law program. And I told him that we didn't want anybody dumb enough in our program who had turned down Harvard and Stanford to come to the Tulane sports law program. You want to go to the best program you can, and I think that's the first thing you should look at.
I would suggest too, looking at internships and co-ops and placements. I certainly wouldn't want to say you should only go to a grad or a law school in a big city, but sometimes the relationships that they form with the sports entities or the colleges and universities in that area can be broader. And obviously it's about the opportunity to go to that next level. And so clearly, again, compared to 20 years ago, your ability to do a ton of research through the web and learn about what all those options are and where they really are placing people, not just who's affiliated with them, but where those placements actually are happening. That would be the way that I would start to winnow it down, assuming that your universe is the entire United States. You've got to winnow it down somehow, right? So not only do you want to go to the best school that you can, but I think, to me, if you're looking at grad schools, it's about where do those graduates go and what do they do and what does their faculty look like? Are there people on the faculty that look like you? Are there people on the faculty that are international and present a global perspective? I think that's probably very important in our world today. So that's what I would add.
Complete agreement with what they've been saying. The other thing I'd say is separate out whether you think you're going for a master's or ultimately a PhD. And if it's at master's level, lots of times I would say ask the question, who do I want to work for? What organization, what company, what network, whatever it is, and see who might have those partnerships or things there that can get you networked in. So, if you, for instance, let's say you want to do sports journalism and your dream job is to write for Sports Illustrated. I know the University of Texas program has some direct lines for people who at least get internships there. And that's all you can ask, is to be able to show them what you can do and have them read it and follow. That could be a good place to go. But if you're seeking out the PhD and you're thinking, hey, I want to be a professor or I want to do some of the things more on the academic side, then it's not really who do you want to work for, it's who could I work with. And you look who's on the faculty and you see who's written things that maybe you say, wow, I'd love to explore that with them in some way there. You start to piece together what would my dissertation committee look like? Who would be on that committee and what would it be about? And the key thing with sports for you to know is being a sports fan alone is not going to get you there. It's just not. Congratulations. If you're a sports fan, you're roughly one part of 75 to 80% of America. The other thing is, knowing sports information is not going to get you there. You cannot out-internet the internet. So forget about, congratulations. If you know every batting average of the Boston Red Sox players since the beginning of time, great. So does the internet. What you need to do is find out what you're passionate about within that. And see who does that. Is that big data analytics? Okay, well, let's see what's a good match between sports work and big data analytics. Is that PR? Is that advertising? Whatever it is. Is it writing? fine. But find something beyond just sports that you can latch onto. Because trust me, one of the biggest mistakes you can make, let's say you got an interview at ESPN and you walk in, why do you want a job at ESPN? Oh, I'm a big sports fan. That's a mistake. They don't need another big sports fan. They need someone who's interested in X, Y, or Z.
Thank you. Questions?
I could add to that, because one thing that everybody needs to know about the sports industry, in almost every industry, networking and who you know is important, but it's probably more so in the sports industry. It is the ultimate networking industry, and people get hired because they know somebody far more often than in any other industry I'm aware of. So when you're picking graduate schools, and again, I haven't gone through the PhD route, but looking for somebody who will be a good mentor at that school, who will be able to introduce you to the right people in the industry. Also a school that has a really strong alumni network of people who've been successful in the industry, because the alumni will come back to school and you'll meet them and they'll give you opportunities. So looking for networking opportunities and whether or not the school will provide those for you is a very important thing, I think, to consider.
And I'll also say, too, there's a difference between, right now in the age of social media, we talk about connections and we're friends on Facebook or whatever it is. There's a whole big difference between having a connection and having someone who will vouch for you. And you want someone who will vouch for you, vouch for your character in some way there. When I write my books now and I need to, try and get someone who might be hard to get for an interview, I have a couple people in the industry who will vouch for me, who will drop them a line and say, hey, it's worth talking to Andy. That's so much better than, oh yeah, I met him at the Steiner Symposium once. It's actually people who can say, this is a good, ethical person trying to do the job the right way.
Thank you. Questions? The other question I get often is students who have decided where they think they want to go in terms of their career, they inevitably ask, do I need more education for this? Do I need a master's degree? Do I need a PhD? Do I need to go to law school for this particular profession? So some targeted questions for each of you, and I'll start with Kathryn. Your career includes positions within the NCAA and with conference affiliations. And our students may not consider those as careers, but if they do, can you share with the students what opportunities are available there, and how important is it to have some education beyond a bachelor's degree?
Thank you. My experiences at the NCAA national office and at a conference office were pretty life-changing for me. And I would say that, the whole world of working in a conference office is significant for all of you to consider. Does everybody know what conference Bradley University is in, other than people that are wearing Bradley logos right now? What conference are Missouri Valley Conference, right? So every conference has fellowships or entry-level opportunities that they would prefer to provide to students from the institutions that are in the conference. I send people all the time to apply for fellowships at the Ivy League or in the Ohio Valley Conference, places that I know have legitimate opportunities. But if they had to choose between if the Ivy League had to choose between someone from Yale and someone from DePaul when they're trying to select who they're going to hire, obviously Yale is in the Ivy League, right? So I feel really strongly that that's great experience. Working in a conference office allows you exposure to a wide variety of sports. It gives you exposure to a wide variety of people. You'll probably be in meetings that involve athletic directors, that involve coaches, that involve those type of people that if you form a relationship with them, it'll last your whole career. As Andy said, if you form a good impression. And that's about being a good person, but it's also about being, oh my gosh, that guy has the most solid work ethic of anyone I've ever met. He came to our conference tournament. It was 4 days long. He was there from 8 a.m. to midnight every night. And he wasn't just BSing in the, in the locker room, he was working that whole time. So conference offices, I think, sometimes get missed because everyone's looking at a pro opportunity or a podcast or something like that. But conference offices are huge catapults for students for sports broadcasting of all types. And the NCAA, the two consulting jobs I'm doing right now are both things that have come to me because of relationships that I developed at the NCAA national office between 1990 and 1994. So you can figure out how old I am when you think about that. But those are folks that are also working really, really hard in the industry in certain sort of niche areas. So if you were fortunate enough to get an internship at the NCAA, when I got that internship, I wanted to be in championships. I thought that would be an amazing way to start my career, to run a championship. Well, guess what? So did everybody else. And so my internship was on the enforcement side, right? And gosh, what a step back for me that I was one of 8 people in the country picked to be an NCAA intern, and I didn't get to do that exact thing that I wanted to do. And it ended up being the perfect thing for me because I learned the NCAA rule book, which isn't an easy thing to do. And it gave me this whole world of compliance that I didn't even know existed because I played at such a small school that I had to recruit them to let me be on the team. So we weren't even in the NCAA. But it gave me that chance to learn about that side of the business, which is really critical.
Was that before or after you got your law degree?
That was before.
Really?
Yeah, that was way before. So, I could actually interpret the NCAA manual before I went to law school.
Hard to believe.
I know. And early on in my career, I crossed paths with President Roberts when he was at Tulane. And, I knew everything about the sports industry, so I didn't need to hear from him because he was only an expert in sports law, but I was too smart to know that then. I would just say that the NCAA office is a really great option. And I don't know how you all would perceive working there, if you would perceive it as unattainable or you would perceive it as sort of I'm not sure how to say it, as something you wouldn't want to do because of how people see the NCAA right now. But there's some amazing people working in Indianapolis doing great things every day, doing really creative things. They job out a lot of what they do on the creative side, but they have a lot of people internally that are doing amazing stuff on the production and technology side. So I would definitely suggest that you consider it. And the conference office, too, may have situations where they have a relationship with their schools, and they may offer a grad assistantship as well if you come from if you're going to attend one of the schools that are part of their league.
I would only add to that, the downside with the NCAA is that there aren't many people there. One of the things with the sports world is that there are millions of young people who want to get into the sports industry in one way or another. And whenever a job opens up, I'm told by people who review resumes that they'll immediately get a stack of 800 applications within a week. And so you've got to be flexible where opportunities come along. And in the college sports realm, there are, almost 1,000 NCAA member institutions, and they all have athletic departments, and there are jobs there. And even the smallest schools usually have their games broadcast somewhere, and they need people to help do that. They all need legal advice. If you want to be a criminal lawyer, college sports is a great place these days.
This is the Gary Roberts I know. Okay.
But seriously, I mean, you have to be flexible. There are a lot of jobs in the sports world, but sometimes you have to look really hard to find them. And you might have to fill out 50 or 60 applications before somebody actually takes an interest. You can't be easily discouraged because every job has a lot of people applying for it. But there is something out there for everybody if you're just doggedly determined to find it. But you really have to be flexible. If you say, I'm going to work for the NCAA, well, right. Maybe so, but there's probably 10,000 people out there who say the same thing. So maybe you'll have to start at a university or an institution or a conference office or wherever. So just keep an open mind about where you're going to land, particularly as you start out.
Yeah, and I'll also say there are a lot of people who want to work in sports, but it's still very much the case that the future is there for those who take it. And I mean, that means putting yourself on the line. That means going the extra mile for something. And I am amazed at the number of people who just, well, I'm hoping someone will discover I have a really pithy Twitter feed. And, you know, I have some interesting things to say. And I know that sounds crazy, but it really is. I remember, gosh, I was at Clemson, and we got this opportunity. ESPN was starting to have a student blogger for each one of the major schools, you know, so the ACC, they were looking for a blogger for every school. Well, I got my best students and said, you got to go grab this. You've got a chance to have a byline on ESPN.com, grab it. And so they did. Well, we can only get one for Clemson. Then we discovered there were 3 other ACC schools. No one said yes. No one raised their hand. 3 of my kids started being bloggers for those ACC schools. And then when they got upset, why does Wake Forest have a blogger from Clemson? I'm like, well, here's why. You know, but you have to be willing to put yourself out there and say yes, whatever it is. Guy on our faculty at Alabama is Lars Anderson, who still writes for Bleacher Report. You know, he had an opportunity at SI. They said, okay, we want you to be a beat writer, but it's for NASCAR. He's like, well, I know nothing about NASCAR. Like, don't care. You know, do you want to do it? And he said, yes. And they're like, good, because 3 people turned it down before you. He cannot even name who those 3 people are beforehand because they didn't go anywhere. His beat became NASCAR. They said, well, that logically fits in the South with college football. So he was the college football beat writer for 20 years. That led to book deals and all sorts of things there. Say yes and figure it out from there. Why? Because his passion was more about storytelling than about any specific sport.
So there's a relationship here, right, with ESPN3? People realize what a big deal that is, right? So if you sign up to do that and you're going to work your butt off and do all the research and show up and, you know, that's significant. Fox College is trying to duplicate that through their Fox U platform, and you know has so much ground to make up because ESPN3 is so significant and it speaks so much to students. So you know, obviously, if that's here and they believe in you guys, and that's how the athletic department's getting their word out, that's huge. So if that's something you sign up for and then you don't show up for or whatever it is, I mean, shame on you because that's huge that Bradley has that.
Gary, as I look down the road 4 years from now, and I'm thinking of our freshmen who may be considering at some point law school, where do you see the opportunities for law school graduates in the context of sports? Where's the opportunity for growth? Where do you think there's going to be a market demand?
Compliance offices of NCAA members. Every school needs a compliance person these days, and increasingly schools are hiring law graduates for those positions because applying the NCAA rule book is a lot like interpreting a statute, and so that's a big source. A lot of smaller market minor league or minor sport teams need legal advice. They usually don't need a full-time lawyer, but if you're willing to take tickets and provide legal advice and help with stadium maintenance and everything else, there will be a lot of opportunities because having that law degree gives you an extra credential and an extra value that people that don't have it, you've got a leg up on them. And it's unlikely you're going to come out of law school and get a job as general counsel of Major League Baseball or the New York Yankees or the Dodgers or whoever. It's unlikely you're going to start out with a gold star type position. But if you start at a lesser known environment, you can quickly work your way up. Although I have a funny story. We were talking last night with Charlie. A good friend of mine is guy named Stan Kasten, who's the president of the Dodgers, and he graduated from law school. And he was just out of law school, and he went to a St. Louis Cardinals baseball game. And he was sitting down there, and the Cardinals were playing the Braves, and he looked down there, and he saw Ted Turner, and he just went down there and plopped down next to him and said, "Do you have a job for me?" And Turner was so taken by the chutzpah that the guy had to ask him that, he gave him a job. And Stan's had a great career, not as a lawyer, but as an administrator with the Braves and all of Turner Sports Enterprises, and then with the Washington Nationals, and now with the Dodgers. So one thing that I would advise is keep your options open. Look for every opportunity, whether it's with the Peoria Chiefs baseball team or with the Bradley University Athletic Department or you name it. But don't be shy either. I mean, if you've got possible connections, go and knock on doors. A former student of mine, Mike Tannenbaum, was a law student at Tulane. Mike was the most persistent pest that anybody had ever seen. He just would not take no for an answer. And right out of law school, he got a job working for the Cleveland Browns. And when they moved to Baltimore, he came back and worked for the Saints in New Orleans. But assistant coach at Cleveland, who was then working for the New York Jets, when the salary cap came in 1994, Bill Parcells said, "We need somebody who understands the salary cap." There was Mike, because he had known Bill Belichick when he was with the Browns. Belichick said, "Well, I know this young kid who just graduated from law school. He's written a paper on the salary cap." Mike went to work for the Jets, and today he's the president of the Miami Dolphins. So you got to be a persistent. You got to look for your opportunities, and they're all over the place. You just have to be very determined and not easily discouraged.
Can I say too, I think another industry that is favorable for people that study sports law is the whole trademark and licensing side. I don't know if you've studied that in your classes thus far, but there are several, CLC and Learfield and IMG are all examples of companies that's their whole niche, right? Is that they police marks for institutions and professional leagues and all the way down the line. And then they also try to get those marks in the stream of commerce, right? So it's an interesting field. It's a little bit different. It may be something that you hadn't thought about, but that's a burgeoning market, as you can imagine, because of how important marks and logos are for institutions, how often they change them, how often they maybe should change them, making them reproducible, especially in the internet world. So I wouldn't rule that out.
Intellectual property is huge
yeah.
these days.
Yeah. Also in the whole stadium management and operations. Before I left DePaul, I was part of negotiating the contract for the arena that they opened last week. So that's a huge part of what you could do with a sports law degree, being part of facilities contracts, stadium operations, all those kinds of things.
Andy, for students who may want to do what we do, teaching and research, scholarship in sports communication, your advice and your sense of the marketplace?
I actually think the marketplace is pretty good for sports-specific scholars or in that area. There's a growing interest in teaching these types of classes. There's a growing respect for it in the field. There's a lot of growth there. If I'm looking at topics that tend to be either underrepresented or starting to grow right now, I would say big data analytics on the media side. And I'm talking specifically about non-content related. And what I mean there is we have a whole bunch of people who can look at, we can create fancy word clouds of here's how the tweets unfolded after Trump tweeted something yesterday or whatever, Kaepernick, whatever it is. We've got plenty of people who are looking at the content. I think there's a need for far more focus on the effects of that content, on the psychology that goes into the production of that content, and the way those interplay with each other. On the non-media side, I think there's a ton of places where we do not have enough scholars or professors that focus in the area. For instance, I think we need far more scholars in sports and interpersonal, sports and ethics, sports and small group, teams, family, sports and religion. I'm fascinated by the combination of sports and religion. The number one reason why people miss church when they were planning on going is attendance or participation in youth sports. The number one reason why many people join a church is because they have a church softball program or something there that got them in, or some affiliation there. There are not nearly the number of people who are looking at some of those interpersonal or group issues that relate to performing and being a part of whatever we call the sports community.
Okay, we are about out of time. I want to end with this question. I hope each of you will take a turn at answering this. One thing that you want this audience to take away from this panel today, what would that be?
I'll start. I guess I would just harken back to about 10 years ago when I was working with student athletes at DePaul, and I had a student athlete in my program that was really critical of the student newspaper. And she came to me and talked about her frustrations, and I said to her, if you don't like what the student paper writes, maybe you should join the student paper and write what you think is the news and what you think is good journalism. And she walked out of my office and she did that, and she went to get her master's degree and had a graduate assistantship in order to pay for it. And then she decided that she wanted to get a PhD. And so she went and did that. And she's sitting here today. It's Professor Antunovich. And so I would just say to you, everyone is capable of a journey like that. Everyone has, Dunya sat in your shoes, guys, and made a commitment to deciding that that was how she wanted to impact the world of sports. And so the things that we're talking about may seem years away, or they may seem like we're old and we're telling you based on experience that's a long time ago, but this is someone that did it in your lifetime and lived the exact world that you did and has made that commitment. So my point is, I'm very proud of her, but also I want you to also see that all of this is extremely attainable. But it's not attainable, as Andy said, because you're a sports fan. It's attainable if you want to outwork everybody else that also wants that same prize at the end of the day.
Thank you.
Well, I'll say that I guess the thing to take away is if you can figure out how to do it, you should get a degree beyond your bachelor's degree because the lifetime benefits of it are enormous. And I would encourage everybody to think about a law degree because that opens up far more doors. You can be a sports broadcaster. Many broadcasters have law degrees these days. You can be a club president, a conference commissioner, a league commissioner. You can, do almost anything with a law degree because it teaches you a skill set that is in great demand throughout the sports industry. But the other thing I would want you to take away from is the importance of hard work and determination, but also being careful and honest. Especially if you're in journalism, you want to make sure that you get your facts straight, that you maintain a high standard of ethical behavior, and that you come across as a class individual. You'll go far in the world if you exude class. You also need a sense of humor, but beyond that, please consider a graduate degree if you can figure out how to pay for it and you're willing to make the sacrifice to get it, because it will pay you dividends for the rest of your life.
And the last thing, because I know we're about out of time here, in communication, and especially in media, one modicum that I always hear people say is, well, you can either be first, be best, or be different. you can be first or be different without grad school. Grad school might give you a higher percentage chance of being the best. And the people who are the best tend not to be flash in the pan, do this for a couple years, whatever it is. They tend to have careers, decades of experience. So if you're thinking, there's something I really want to know, there's something I really want to explore, and that can help me be the best in the field at X, take that time and become that, because that'll help you stand out.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking these panelists for sharing their time and their expertise. And the next session is in this room in about 10 minutes. It's Sports Public Relations.
I like that
Thank you for
bag.
your attendance and enjoy the
I like that
symposium.
bag.